Hello, I am Mildred Constantine, and I serve as curatorial advisor to the American Craft Museum for its exhibition Architectural Art, Affirming the Design Relationship. Behind me, you can see an area of the installation of this exhibition. This exhibition is a response to the challenges and attempts to vividly display the finest examples of artists' and architects' site-specific work created in the 1980s. In developing the conceptual framework for the exhibition, an exercise has been jointly created by the American Craft Museum and the New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects. 4 teams of architects and artists have been paired to collaborate and design a specific environment for the exhibition. What follows is a series of dialogues by the 4 regional artist-architect teams. We go first to California. Frederick Fisher, architect, and Tony Berland, artist, both from Santa Monica, distinguish between the technical and aesthetic attributes each party brings to the design process. The title of their environment is Earthquake Shelter. Then on to the New York team of architects, Todd Williams and Billy Tsin, and artist Mary Miss. They critique that condition when one confronts a work of art or architecture and to be able to extend themselves out beyond that. Their piece is entitled Telephone Booths. We then move down to the south, where architects Peter Waldman and Christopher Gannick and artist Edward Wilson, all of Houston, Texas, consider the beautiful void which can be eliminated through collaborative efforts. Their piece is entitled 3 Transformations, or Totem to Tomb. On to South Carolina in Charleston, where architect Dan Stuver of Clark and Menifee and artist Judith Morrill Haynes of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, assess the unresolved future of collaborations. Their environment is entitled Chapel. In considering the following remarks, please keep in mind that unlike traditional ornament, architectural art retains its own integrity and power. For architecture, this is the new challenge, achieving a true collaborative spirit and pointing to a new kind of integration of art within architecture. I invite you now to share in these compelling and revealing dialogues.
I have never done a genuine collaboration that I can think of with anyone else. I've worked with other people, but never where you start absolutely at the beginning together.
I think that to an architect, there could be more appeal to the notion of a collaboration than possibly to the artist, because we are ordinarily tied up in the demands of client, budget, legality, technical problems, schedules, and I think have this romantic notion of the artist as being much more free than we are. And so any artist-architect collaboration seems to imply, I think, to the architects a bit of liberation from their normal constraints and a ability to participate in the so-called artistic license, which we are, I think, normally more bound than that implies. At least that's the outsider's view. Whereas I think my perception is that artists feel that if they get involved with architects, it may be at some expense to their own integrity and their own will, because they don't usually have to deal with anybody else, whereas architects always have to deal with lots of other people.
Yeah, well, we pay for our artistic license by being a totally free enterprise, entrepreneurial spirits in a way, and also having a tradition in which objects not being sold or not being accepted is not necessarily a criteria of not being successful. But it's very foreign to us, the idea of any kind of compromise. Collaboration can also mean compromise, and any kind of adjustment or compromise is really verboten. But it was interesting that working on this project was a completely natural, kind of free associative, organic experience. And it really has, since I'm also involved with a couple of other architectural collaborations, one specifically, it changed my attitude about how closely it's possible for a number of people to work together.
In a way, it's something I wanted to force myself to do and in any way I can in order to avail myself of those ideas, which in this case certainly was the case, and it's a luxury in order to do something which programmatically is very different from a building, which doesn't have to follow the constraints that a building does, and allows me to just go into a mine of ideas, in other words, Tony's head, that I don't ordinarily have access to, and which I know I'm going to be able to exploit in the future in making buildings. So, there's very selfish reasons for me to want to do this.
Well, it's interesting to me that because we have complete freedom as artists, our work can, after a while, one finds the place you like to go to, and you go there all the time, in terms of your work or the potentials. And what I found most interesting about this is that I had the opportunity to do something that doesn't look like my work, and yet was a genuine, spontaneous and felt thing that we did together. It gave me a chance to get outside of my normal way of working, and I found that it's real exciting because it has the aspect of remembering what it's like to be a student, where you're given this assignment that just comes out of nowhere and you fall on it and make something in a way that you have never made before and that you never necessarily intend to make again. So there was a kind of innocence, unfamiliarness, and open territory. And I think we were both, either we've made something really wonderful or we're victims of self-delusion, which is always a question in art, but in this case, I think we did something really quite wonderful in terms of our own personal growth. I knew of Fred and had confidence in him, and at least it was worth trying it to see what would happen. And once, you didn't have any uneasiness about this, did you?
No, not at all. It's the feeling of uncertainty, I took as a positive thing, and that often, if a client approaches me for a building project, I have in mind what I want to do with it very early on, because I do buildings all the time. And there's a certain amount of trepidation from the fact that I don't make objects, I make spaces, and so the process of making an object is very difficult for me, so there's a little bit of trepidation in that process alone.
Well, every time we'd meet, we'd have a little miracle would happen to the piece, and maybe to the world at large they don't appear to be miracles, but it's when you're making something and suddenly the solution just jumps out, and there it is, and oh, isn't that wonderful? And every time there's a problem, the problem results in some kind of advantage, and I thought that happened very, very steadily throughout the whole process. But as soon as I went into your office and sat down in your little office, I knew that we were going to do well, because you had a kind of panorama shot of prehistoric animals. It had been a favorite of mine since I was a child, and you had a kind of homemade spear hanging over the portal to the entrance to your area. Did you make that as a child? It's like an Indian spear.
No, I actually got that at Mardi Gras a couple of years ago.
So I thought,
One of the things that was thrown off a float.
Yeah, so I thought this, there were a lot of detail. There were about 100 little objects like that in this place, and they were all very simpatico, and I realized, this is a good environment to pan for gold in.
I think the only aspect of this which had any character of a separation of roles was that we had some discussion of the how an architect tends to figure out how things are made, and that there was a certain point in the process when we had basically designed the object and made a maquette of it in increasingly large scales of foam core, and then the next step had to be take it up to life size and eventually make it. And my memory is that there was some comment about the architect figures out how things go together, and that that step would somehow be made by either me coming up with some details or finding a fabricator. And in this case, as I said, I'm not much of an object maker, and so for me to sit down and figure out how this thing is welded together and what size steel it's made out of and all that is something I was not at all comfortable with. And so rather than taking on that role and saying, okay, I'll figure out how this thing gets screwed together and the weight of the metal and all this kind of stuff, I immediately reached out for another person in the process, in this case Pamela Burgess, the artist who's a welder who made this for us. And Pamela then began to come up with ideas as to how this thing could be made for a budget which is extremely tight, and how it could also knock down so it can be shipped, and how it could be not so heavy that it would be impossibly expensive and awkward to ship.
Yeah, well, I think an important point was when we realized that the commission was actually just an opportunity for us to make something for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And when we started getting excited about this as something that we wanted to keep, you know, I mean, for me that's always part of the criteria. We realized, gee, this is really going to be a neat thing, and we're making it so, and we'd be happy to have it, to keep it. And we started thinking about how we would use it and how it could function, and it became something that was then being generated by our personal needs rather than just an external commission.
Actually, on the way down here, we were talking it over and recalling the whole process, and the way we started was after an initial phone call, we had lunch, decided to have lunch together, and in the course of a lunch, probably in 15 minutes during that period, we pretty much had the piece conceptualized, and which is some index of how easy it was, you know, moving ideas back and forth that interested us both. And it was not so much, it was not a power struggle at all. It was certainly, I came into it with certain assumptions that were different than what we ended up with, but that was completely all right with me. In fact, I'm always glad to end up with something which I didn't expect to start with, because it makes it much more interesting. But as an architect, I assumed that we were going to do a little room. We had these parameters of an 8-foot cube, I think, we were given to work within. And so because I tend to make space rather than objects, rather than make a big object, I thought of making a small space. And I think what we ended up with was actually both, which is what really interests me in that it's a piece of furniture which is also a room.
Well, the earthquake, it just happened. That was always, it's always helpful to have something happen. That, so we had something, that a shared experience. The piece came out of just talking about the earthquake and talking about Japanese shrines and ceremonial interiors that you were talking about, and it all just clicked together very, very quickly. What I thought was very interesting is, besides talking about formal things, we, like, should this shape be longer and the shape shorter and the shape thinner? We were talking about psychological associations to the imagery, which is what artists at least do when they're working, which I don't associate so much with architecture. We were talking about how this space evoked certain childhood memories of crawling under the table and discovering a space for yourself, and then the formal decisions we made grew out of really internalized psychological associations, which isn't the way I think about starting to build something in an architectural sense. And there were times when I would say, well, this area over here seems a little weak. I think you should architect it. I like the look of the way you do that in your buildings, the way you make these junctures happen. And so this is dull, Fred. So would you? I think you ought to architect this area, and you'd work on it, and then you'd say, should it be up a little bit? I'd say, move it over a little to the right. We would do it back and forth together, taking turns holding up the board. Or drawing the thing around, and that was very easy, and it really shows you how the history of the world, the history of art and architecture in the world, that people used to build things like that together, and that they didn't feel that the individual was so estranged from all the other individuals that they couldn't work together with a kind of shared vision and process.
I felt that it opened a door for me in terms of making me more comfortable with trying to make objects like this, and that it's something which I've really stayed away from, because I found that I could design a building in the amount of time it took me to design a table, and it didn't seem to be a really good application of my time and skills if that was that out of balance, and so I've stayed away from making objects. And the satisfaction with doing this leads me to not categorically avoid doing that anymore.
Well, I think the strength of being able, and how it is not a compromise to have to work with somebody else or to work with somebody else, and that it can provide access to areas of yourself that you haven't been involved with. And I think that was a real growth experience. And it doesn't come out of being clever, and it didn't come out of extensive research. It just came out of a little miracle of making a genuine gesture.
Billy, Mary, and I were aware of one another's work a number of years ago, and were interested in the possibilities of collaboration generally. And actually, this particular project simply feathered into an idea that we had about collaboration, an opportunity that we wanted to exercise in collaborating with one another. At any rate, I think that one of the obvious things that Mary's work carries is architectural content, and she is one of the artists and sculptors that we look to, and I think architects generally look to when they're looking at artists who are aware of and contribute to the world of architecture.
I think the idea was really important to me, of finding a way to work with architects, that if I wanted to step outside of the museum and gallery context that I had been in, I had to find a way to work in that real world outside, and that meant finding architects whose way of thinking seemed to have something related to the way I was thinking.
The thing that we were really interested in was this idea of somehow making an entry. And I think it was difficult when we were given the Crafts Museum project, because it seemed so singular unto itself, and we were very concerned about trying to make something that had a meaning that extended beyond a sort of object placed within a museum. So in a sense, I think one of the things that we first did was to try and make, in a way, a kind of program for the piece.
We really wanted something that people could step into, pick up the telephone and use, and not just something that you look at.
There were other issues that I think we were interested in and had talked about previously. One was how three people actually could collaborate and be expressed. And in some obvious way that occurs by the tripartite organization of the figure that we made. And another interest that you had expressed and exists within your work is this idea of the mandala. But something which is, again, not solely a kind of whirlpool in, but goes not only in and out, but also out. The windows that not only look in, but the windows that also look out. So these were ideas that existed that were, again, kind of common ground that we could work with.
Mm-hmm. I think, though, the nature of a collaboration it's something that's just really beginning to happen. I mean, the whole process of collaborating, and it's a myth that exists in a way that people were once able to collaborate, and that there were working relationships that produced great things, and it's almost as though we're in attempting a collaboration. It's like you're going into some territory that there's some mythical map about, and now we're going in and trying to find that track again, or establish a new track.
Well, giving birth to any creative work, I believe, involves pain. And certainly, I think you're absolutely right that there is a kind of myth that there one time was a way of collaborating that was successful and perhaps might have been without pain. But first, I think that time was under very different circumstances. Not only was it a time, as we really think about it, during the Renaissance, when the whole world of art was much better integrated into the ideas about the humanities, but also it was a time when there were patrons who would actually dictate the sort of structure by which different characters would fit into what appears today to be a kind of collaborative process. But we don't have that today, and I think that this is totally an uncharted territory. There are a few people who have done it in the past. We also have done it in the past. And I think it's, Billy and I think I can speak for the two of us, believe that it's important territory that has to be taken on if we are really to expand our own vision as artists, as architects.
But I think it's so fragile. I mean, I think so much of it is based on the sort of tiptoeing and working back and forth the relationship of the artist and the architect. And I think that there's a problem because it's really become a kind of thing in vogue now. And so that people every day there are more sort of requests for proposals for collaborations between artists and architects. And I think that it's, I mean, I feel that it's a much more difficult and fragile and personal kind of relationship and interaction that has to happen between the people who are doing it, and it's and I would say that the majority of collaborations that are put together now through developers or for other the large projects that are coming up it's going to be interesting to see whether they succeed, because I would say that it's so, in a way, personal that many of them are really doomed to fail.
I would disagree. I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing that people are talking about it and trying to attempt these things. I think that the problem is that people don't realize that it's not something that just automatically happens. They'll see the results of a successful collaboration and they think, oh, great, that's the way to proceed. But it is a very particular thing that happens in certain situations with certain people. And I think one of the important things is for artists and architects to attempt to build relationships with people that they really feel that they can work with.
It's very hard to find a kind of equality between the artist and the architect, and I think that when people come in as collaborators, they have to respect each other and have a certain level of, strength in their own world.
The idea of collaboration being in vogue right now, I think, is a real one. My concern, and although I'm not certain that, because all birthing processes take a great deal of pain, I'm not sure that I'm ready for another one immediately. That my concern is that they will go out of vogue next year, and that this idea will disappear as quickly as it actually appeared. And I would say that it would be best if it somehow finds a level of where it has a kind of critical possibility for integration within the realm of work that one can take on.
I think that that's really the important thing. It's like you see the role of the artist and the architect, you know, going along side by side. And there are, I really like the fact that these roles get, you know, start to lay on top of each other or cover each other or slip to the other side or then reverse. I like the idea that all of these things are possible, that the architect might be the one who's looking more at the functional concerns, and the artist may be looking more at the layers of implications at one point, and then at another point maybe the artist is really trying to figure out how something works or why it works, and the architect is you know, looking at those layers of implications. I think that that's what I feel really needs to happen, just for all of our sakes, you know, for the work to really continue, everybody's work to continue to become richer.
I think that too often the architect takes his or her role for granted, and although we pay lip service to that the architectural process is inherently a positive collaboration with these various ingredients, I think too often we don't look at them with the kind of level of respect that we might, let's say, another individual. And that's one of the kinds of stimulus that this particular process can give us as architects.
One of the things I think is nice about working on, I mean, we've been complaining about working on a small object. We're saying how it's brought up a lot of difficulties, but I think a nice thing is the ability to work in collaboration with the people who are making the objects as well. So of course right now we're in Stephen Eno's workshop, and I think that throughout the sort of making of it, he's brought ideas and thoughts about how this thing can go together in a way that is both makes sense and has a certain kind of elegance to it, and at the same time retains the original vision that we had, that are very positive.
Another aspect of the project that I think that we were let's say both or all interested in was that it not be of a single material. And so it's, in fact, our project is made of wood and metal, and it exists in its own separate creative lives in this wood shop and also downtown in the metal shop, and will come together in the museum, you know, in another
Hopefully.
way.
I think that we settled on the form, the rough form, fairly early. It really became a series of decisions about refining the form and the details of the form. But I think very early, I mean, that's a very early model. Mm-hmm. We had the general form, and then it's really the sort of refinements and details. And then finally, the materials were, I think, a kind of further refinement of the details rather than a sort of starting point. I think for us, the form was the starting point, mm-hmm. and then we figured out how we wanted that form to present itself.
Well, I mean, I will say that is true, that I think that this is where both Billy and Mary probably had greater common ground than I did, because I was the one that was always saying, let me try to understand how this thing is made, and was one of the parts that most interested me. So at that point, I would say that their roles combined together differently than, let's say, Billy's and mine would have.
I guess as an artist, the thing that got me interested in this area, one of the things that got me interested was I'm always trying to, you know, it's like I'm taking a certain path that I find interesting, but I don't want to stay within the tracks on that path. And I think any artist, whether you know it's a painter, a sculptor, or whatever, you're always trying to find ways beyond that which you're already interested in and which you already know about. And what happens when you're working with other people is that you just get knocked out of this path regularly. I mean, and puts you into a position, a context that you never would have expected to be in. But given the history of your own thinking that you're bringing with you, it can have very interesting results or implications, spin-offs. And then you take that information and you take it to the next thing that you're doing. And it's kind of like those bumper cars, where you...
God, horrible thought, but I guess it is.
When the opportunity for this show came up last fall, I was contacted by the American Craft Museum, and though they suggested some artists to collaborate with, I suggested Ed's name, because though we had worked very minimally on the project, I knew what such a fantastic joiner he was, and if I could use that in a way, that we were thinking this would be an opportunity to make a room, but to make a room or to construct a room. And as such, I suddenly realized that I'm this pivotal thing, because Chris and I have been working together since 1984 on architectural projects. And I've known that Ed's been around for at least that long at Rice. And it just happened that though we didn't specifically work on any project like this at all, with Ed, that in the collaboration we developed an association rather than a previous experience.
Now, I guess there was a little bit of familiarity with each other's work, but I wouldn't say it was a real thorough
only from a distance
familiarity of what each of us was up to.
And actually it seems that all preconceptions changed, in my mind at least, and in the process of doing something in common.
Well, I find it very intriguing. The process has had a lot of loopholes, and I would not even presume to call it a process, but I think that our work has been augmented by this association. I think that we've learned some interesting techniques, we've learned some interesting ways to take materials and to just consider them in a manner perhaps that we personally would have not have done just within the boundaries of our own practice. And that came from kind of being presented with a whole new series of opportunities that came from UED and from the kinds of materials and the kinds of worlds that you deal with every day. And that was very, very eye-opening to us, I think.
Well, I think what you're saying there really states fairly clearly what I perceive as being the differences between what you do and what I do as a sculptor working in the studio and having hands-on as part of my system of working. And yours, I think, and probably the case with most architects, is paper and somewhat removed from the actual hands-on process. And a lot of decisions that I make in my own work comes from reacting
Right there on the spot.
Right on the spot.
There were two things we did. I think we make decisions on the spot to solve problems, but we also make problems for ourselves. I think from the beginning we conceived of the project, the room, the original challenge, as in two parts. One thing is to make a box which would contain the piece to go from place to place, and the other one was the piece itself. And we started with the piece within for a long time. We actually met in the beginning, I think, once or twice a week and try to make progress and throw out ideas. We seemed to throw out more ideas and be left with less and less week after week in the beginning.
That was never a problem, it was coming up with ideas for us.
But it was fixing it, and then we shifted at a time to see what the object was like, and we said, well, we'll roll it in on a dolly. And then we said, well, instead of the dolly, maybe we'll invent a case or a means, and then it ended up being a wheel by which this thing could roll in by itself. We should say that we started out with the idea, which is very singular, maybe artistic and individual, that we would make 3 of these. one for each of us at the end. So after the process was done, at least we would return to our own self-piece, and that we would display 3 of them in different positions of transformation in the gallery as we got into it in the real dimensions and all the things we wanted to do in time constraints. We actually ended up doing one piece.
And that was, I think, fantastic, because that came definitely from this process where architects, I think, are trained to deal with programmable or programmed space. And Ed said, no, we can have a beautiful void and we can just put one thing in it and it could be as rich, if not richer, than something that was incredibly programmed and dense and full of articulated pieces.
I think it gains a lot of strength by sorting out the things, like you say, that are irrelevant. I think that's important. And it's interesting that you say this is a real simplification from the way you normally approach things. This is a very complex thing for the way that I normally approach things. Because of my own work, I look for economy of means and forms and whatever to get the idea across.
And in our own work, we could speak individually or collectively, we certainly seek for the multiplicity of readings, which is not necessarily contradictory to an economy of means, but in this way, we put the two together where in previous projects, there were quite a number of quite articulated and distinct pieces all coming on in to add to the multiplicity. Here we have fewer pieces, a very simple wheel in one term and a very simple cabinet or box or room collaborating. So it can be more easily described, which I think is its strength, which Ed was very insistent on. There's another aspect, though, which is still strange to me that comes up, which has not so much to do with the economy as making marks or scratches on surface. It's the patina or nature of surface that is assigned to the wheel, which is not about the initial discussion of economy or reduction, but there was one beautifully sunny March afternoon that we got out there with acrylic paints and blow torches and files and other marking things, and participated without an initial plan except for maybe variety to mark that surface. And I don't know what that is, but I think it's about another artistic idea than economy or the problem solving.
Well, I mean, I think of the surface that we put on there, on those wheels. It deals with something that I like to deal with a lot in my own art, and that's using that surface to mystify in a way, or to put an aesthetic distance between observer and the object. It's not a common surface that we're accustomed to seeing, so it adds a bit of mystique to the object.
I mean, I think that it's a process of mystification. In my mind, it's also a process of criticism, that you take the material as it's given and you begin to explore it and ask questions of it. And that putting into question, I think, is a very, very important issue, because you take something as found and you begin to wonder how it might express an idea, or how it might be augmented by fulfilling better the task. It's a process of self-evaluation, I think, in terms of the material, but it's also establishing boundaries and limits for what the object is.
Well, actually, I think the two in together in this collaboration is better than one or the other, because that's why I like the purity of the box and the patina, if we could say, of the wheel, in that they take on both art and architecture's capacity to imply, to allude to things, as well as to being very much of this world. Architecture, maybe more so than art, has to, in some way, serve a number of people rather than the individual creator. We've been asked to respond to the nature of our working relationship as we began this project, about if we predefined our working roles, if we felt threatened at any point in it, and if there were any power struggles in the process.
I don't really feel that we had any power struggles per se, and I don't really feel like I was threatened in any way. For the most part, I mean, I think that our relationship worked out fine. We got along very well. I mean, I must admit to quite a bit of frustration at various times along the way, and I think that frustration really comes from what I'm used to doing. I'm used to being an individual artist in the studio. Whenever I make an object, I mean, I react on the spot and make decisions very quickly, and just do the work. And it's frustrating, and it was frustrating, I guess, for me to wait to get a consensus.
And I think that that's kind of an interesting question, because as we were talking about this morning, artists and architects have been collaborating for a very, very long time, and they've been doing it, but they've always done it with a predetermined kind of relationship. In our own practices, in our own work, we all operate in very different fashions. And we've almost had to reestablish the grounds for working to do this project.
I think that we all have creative temperaments. I think what's pretty remarkable is how civil we've been, given the individual qualities that we have in the process, which is necessary to be passionate about that which we do and that which we think, that's which we make.
Well, I think that the kind of renewed interest, or the direction that this show is trying to set, is clear, that they want to get a dialogue going between artists and architects. The thing that I find slightly funny about it is that this is a dialogue that to some extent has been going on for a very, very long time now, that is outside of certainly our realm. It will probably keep on going despite the impact of the project, or even despite the impact of the show. I'm sure the show will set to contribute to get a discussion going. But I suspect at the end that artists and architects will keep on collaborating to some extent in different ways, and the collaborations in their nature change, obviously, from one project to the next.
I feel like, and I felt sort of emotional ups and downs through the whole process here. Right now, I feel like the frustration and the all the things involved with it maybe are not really worth it in the end. Next week, I may answer that completely different. We're still so close to it. Yeah.
See, but you can then see how compromised the architectural process is, and how wonderfully graced you are for being an artist, because you are very much in that control.
That's the greatest thing about being an artist, I think, is that complete freedom to do what you want as you want to do it.
It's another kind of social event, I don't know what to call it, collaboration that when architecture merges, if it ever does, is out of all these encounters of compromises and limitations.
I mean, that's an interesting point, because I think that the architect does have to be responsible and accountable to many, many different realms and trades and agendas, and the artist thrives on exactly the opposite. And if we look at it singly from our own perspective, we'll see both good and bad. We'll both want to maybe do it again or not, but it takes a third kind of person to tell us whether it's of value for what they're looking for. I suspect it is.
I think it would have been considerably easier if we had picked each other because of some kind of similarity of vision or similarity of approach, because I think it took that first step was very difficult, because we had to spend a lot of time kind of walking around each other and trying to see where things you thought worked with what I thought. And one of the things I felt like strongly was that in a situation where you have two people who may have very different approaches, someone has got to acquiesce and allow the other person. I don't think there's room, especially in a project this size, for more than one vision. And you have to decide whose vision that would be. In this case, I felt like that the architecture part was extremely important, because it would be so easy for this to become a sculpture. It's for a museum. There are no specific architectural problems to solve in the sense that you have with a regular building. So that if the architecture itself didn't sort of predominate as the vision, it'd be a sculpture. And I think you all felt that at the beginning when you decided you really wanted it to be a thing that was to scale, that was the size that it would actually be. It was not going to be a model of something, it wasn't going to be a piece of something, it was going to be a whole thing that was
And that comes to the
size.
the first decision was that we were going to make a thing, in terms of it being an artifact, or in terms of it being a usable thing. And we felt that 8 feet was, first of all, large enough to make a space, whether it be internal or external, which is something we debated for quite a while at the very beginning. And, you know, these very preliminary decisions got us going, and it's remarkable how those things influence the project, no matter how many different ideas we bounced around. Coming back to those sort of essential beginning points was rather critical, and those were the things I thought that got us over some of the humps.
I certainly think thinking of it as a thing to scale was a pivotal start, because that eliminated a lot.
Yeah.
Which was kind of a relief. It was like, you know, all of a sudden you don't have a white canvas anymore. You've got a canvas that you're doing something. You're headed some direction, and you don't have to think about every single possibility for what could fit in or be part of an 8-foot cube.
Exactly.
I think we were all pretty mature about the whole process. I mean, there were things in the...
Didn't bite.
We didn't, yeah. You know, I mean, I can see how in situations like this it would be easy for things to become, if not acrimonious, difficult. But I didn't sense that in any of our any of our dealings. There were things in the situation that I found threatening or difficult. Not threatening is not quite the right word, but that put me, say, off balance a little. I think the distance was a big factor, a very difficult thing. It meant that when I had ideas, I couldn't just stop in with a little bit of a sample and say, what do you think about this? Is this on track, off track? I did, like that whole series of drawings I did, they were developed to be much further along than I would normally have for just a set of ideas, but it's because there was no way to communicate. Right. So that, it was hard for me in a way to also, not being used to presenting ideas to other people, it was very difficult for me to bring in half an idea and hope, you know, not knowing whether you all would see all the possibilities in it or not, to present things that weren't developed because they looked stupid half the time. And that part of it was a little threatening. And in finally doing the final work, I find it very difficult to do the work on a building that is constructed, and once you've done it, it's there forever. There's not room for mistakes. You don't throw away the stuff that turns out badly, which is what I usually do because I work at home alone, and I'm on my own, and if it doesn't work, I bury it somewhere or I save it for something that'll tell me later. This, you know, and that's affected how I worked on everything I've done, feeling that I had to get things to a point where there would be no, there might be surprises, but we wouldn't have bad surprises. We wouldn't have stuff that I really wished I could bury and have to show the whole world instead.
Working with an artist, I think, has been, in a certain way, a lot simpler than that. Because even though you spoke before about somebody's vision, choosing somebody's independent vision for the thing, it's not so much that, it's just that, you know, what will a person be handling? What part of the vision does a person involve himself with? And obviously, we involve ourselves a little more structurally with the thing. And we could have chosen to do otherwise, but when you're working with other architects, they not only can have a different vision about something, but they could also have a different way of executing that vision. And it's really just a problem of form language and things of that nature. But in terms of collaboration, I think the idea that we're sort of perpendicular to each other to begin with by nature makes it easy. It's a lot like working with another engineer, working with somebody who comes at a similar thing from another angle. Mm-hmm. Because we've always been talking again and again about pretty much the same thing.
I think this is a very unusual project because usually I think art is done in conjunction with architecture, not in collaboration with architecture. And I think that when you have a real building, when you have a real building, there are a lot of structural things that come first. I mean, that an artist is not equipped with or equipped to deal with, and there are a lot of. I think this is unusual that an artist would be able to be as involved in the design process as early on as I was. I think that's basically an unreal situation and probably would continue to be in most in most cases. I think what really turned this into a collaboration was, well, we started out doing a chapel. I mean, we got to the chapel point, and we started talking about symbols, and I'd come down with all kinds of very Baroque ideas about chapels and religion and all that, and it was something that Charlie said about feeling that a symbol should be abstract enough so that it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think that's the gist of it. Whereas my approach was you take a symbol and you load it with as much meaning from other places that you enrich the symbol and you expand the symbol. And those are two very different attitudes. We went basically with a pared down symbol for this building, so that actually the building itself began to mean different things to each one of us. What would you do in the building? What would you do in there? You'd do one thing, I'd do another thing. We allowed it to be a lot of different things to all of us, which meant that there was not one specific idea from which everything derived, the way you would have a program in a normal building. I need an X house, I need an aquarium, right. I need a this. So where did the design decisions come from? Well, what finally happened, I think the pivotal decision was to decide to do this building in copper. That the pivot of this in a lot of, I mean, the idea of retreat was important and a lot of those things were very important, but where we met was on copper, was on the material. That is what we basically, I think, where there was a real common ground, it was an interest in the fabric of the building, the materials. Before that, I think there had been suggestions about what you might do, or you'd suggest to me, like, I mean, when, well, I mean, I thought it took, well, real guts to sort of ask me if I would mind if we sawed my piece in half and put it on either side of a joint, you know. That was a suggestion coming from what you'd seen about my work, because it turned out I loved the idea. You know, I mean, it was a whole new way of looking at the gesso, and I was tired of looking at the gesso the way I had before. But I think it was more suggestions about possibilities, and then would that be okay, or what do you think of that, more than my doing something that influenced you, you doing something. What did you think? I'm talking all
you know, there's this wonderful little thing you've touched on, because you mentioned a long time ago this nice little theory that the meaning in your work is in the context exclusively. You talked a little bit about painting chairs, I think it was. You know, you could paint chairs all you want, but the meaning of the work really comes from where the thing is. And when we made this internal volume, which really fluctuated from external to internal, we were trying to, we were thinking we had no context. There was no architectural problem involved in the thing other than using up all the money they give us. So basically, we were looking for that context, and your work really afforded itself context. We talked about it being an organic work. It didn't have to literally be like that. But the fine point is that when we had these brooding sessions for days and days about what to do in terms of symbolically what it is, it wasn't until we took the first steps that allowed us to deal with context that all that fell away. And it's a nice point that architecture symbolically can exist in terms of context and not necessarily on this direct idea that we must force symbol down the throats of form. It's a very, very nice point, I think, that context can be the thing, because it's really sort of what this thing that Lou Kahn said about a building talking back to you, allowing yourself to listen or work, you know, let the building tell you what it wants to do. And honestly, the copper was constantly telling us at a certain point what it wants to do. And
certainly in all that I've been doing lately, the building has been telling me a lot. I mean, the building told me what to do about the gesso piece. I had a lot of stuff I thought about doing, and I just, you know, you look at it and say, this is not right. It's a very demanding building, a very specific building, and you can sort of tell right away whether something's right or not most of the time.
And that's a very similar architectural process. It's very similar, at least I should say, to the way that we design things in terms of the building generally is made the way that it was made. You know, the more information that comes in about how it's made will show up in the building itself. We're not here to conceal anything. We're here to sort of to reveal the qualities that are already in the parts that we're making. And in that sense, your work is it's miraculously aligned to the way that we work, or that you can work with an artist. Had we worked with somebody who was specifically interested in working towards the end of meaning, and then the process of creating the work had been something else, it would have been very much different. When you're asked to do something that's where this place is not specified, and then you're appalled at a certain point where they give you a place, they say, oh, okay, now here's the place you're going to put it in. It's a terrible trick. It's a kind of trick that architecture faculty pull on you that just make you furious when they, you know, there's just nothing good to be said about it. I mean, basically these things could be thrown about any space.
And the one thing that you do want to do when you do something like this is to make it create its own space. That's what you're doing with this project, trying to make it create a space. So you don't want to have it framed, right. And you don't want people not to be able to walk around it since you've made it three-dimensional. You want it to sit there and say what it's got to say.